Paul Levinson is of Fordham University, works in the study of media, and in particular focuses on science fiction, but he's one of those illustrious few who has excelled not just in the study of science fiction, but also as a science fiction author himself. And I'm grateful to him for also having given me an opportunity to enter that world to just that little tiny bit that I have. So Paul, thank you so much for being part of this event and for all you do for science fiction authors and the study of science fiction. And I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you, James. And just for future reference, I'm always ready to go. So it's no problem at all. I'm going to talk today about Jesuits in space. And but just to let you know, I'm going to try in the 20 or so minutes that I have to give more of a broad overview and historical context and less of a scene-by-scene analysis in the actual novels and stories that I talk about. So to begin with, let's go back to the year 1540. This is the year in which the Jesuit order begins in the Roman Catholic Church. And that was something that was created by eventually Saint Ignatius Loyola. He wasn't a saint back then. It was created as a response to the Protestant Reformation. And here's an important thing to recognize, and this is something I've done some research and written a lot about among the many things that I do. One of the key ingredients in the Protestant Reformation, one of the reasons why it happened was because the printing press had made books available in mass across Europe. Before the printing press, all there were, of course, were handwritten manuscripts. So when Martin Luther came along and said people should read the Bible for themselves, he was saying that not just as a theoretical or theological point, he was saying it as something that had a practical way of happening and being implemented. And as a matter of fact, as we all know, there were heresies, as the Roman Catholic Church called them, throughout its history. But it was Martin Luther's read the Bible for yourself. You don't need to go to a priest. You don't need to go to church to have a relationship with God. You can work it out yourself just by reading the Bible. So the Counter-Reformation was aware of this. And unlike a lot of the Roman Catholic Church of that time said, we can't just ignore this. We can't just assume that people are not going to read. And many other things were happening around this time. Galileo and Copernicus were changing the nature of what human beings thought of Earth and its relationship to the stars. But the Jesuits in particular made a point of saying, look, we have to get out there into the world. We have to engage the knowledge that is now bursting out all over. We can't just continue to insist that Aristotle was right and Galileo was wrong, and all the other things that the church had bought into and was proselytizing. So with that in mind, it's not surprising that the Jesuits in their future would have in many cases a cutting edge role, both in reality and in science fiction. Now, in reality, just to get back into our time machine and, now to move into the 20th century, the 1940s, the 1950s, there was, in fact, a Jesuit by the name of Teilhard de Chardin, who is a very important thinker in my field of media theory and media studies. By the way, I have a lot of fields. I have science fiction, I have media studies, I have music. I like to do as much damage as possible. But Teilhard de Chardin was a very profound thinker. And one of the things that he talked about was the noosphere, by which he meant the evolution of consciousness to a point where there would be one worldwide consciousness. And this is a very interesting thought. Actually, it didn't begin with Teilhard de Chardin. It went back as far as the middle of the 19th century, the 1800s, and Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel House of the Seven Gables, in which his character Clifford muses at some point that because of the telegraph, the world was being changed into one big pulsating brain. I mean, that's pretty good for the middle of the 1800s. But Teilhard was no doubt aware of that. He was a very erudite man, and that was no doubt one of the things that stimulated him to think about the noosphere. And of course, from our perspective here, now beginning the third decade of the 21st century, the internet is clearly an embodiment and a realization and an expression of that as well. But to now move a little beyond Teilhard, who again did a lot of his path-breaking work in the 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s, we come to James Blish, who, when I was growing up, he was one of my favorite science fiction authors. And as some of you aficionados of science fiction may know, back in the 1950s, there was a triumvirate of Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and Arthur C. Clarke. They were the big three in science fiction. And by the way, here, let me share with you a true story. When I was in junior high school, one day I received an ominous note from the homeroom teacher that the librarian, the school librarian, wanted to see me. So, okay, I don't know why she wanted to see me. I mean, I'm a nice guy. I was a, pretty well-behaved kid. So I went down there. She calls me into her office, and she has this grim look on her face and it says, "Do you know why I called you down here?" And I said, "No, I don't." And she passes a sheet of paper over to me. And as soon as I looked at the sheet of paper, I had an inkling as to why she was calling me into her office, because on that sheet of paper was the title of every book I had taken out of the library. I was in 7th grade then. And each and every one of them was a science fiction novel. So the librarian said to me, "Well, you can see what the problem is. All you're reading is science fiction." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, she shared this brilliant analogy with me. She said, "If all you do is eat one thing, you'll get physically ill. If all you do is read one thing, you'll get mentally ill." And I didn't say this to her, but I remember thinking, well, it's too late for me, as far as getting mentally ill. Anyway, she said to me, "We're not going to let you take any more books out of the junior high school library unless you begin branching out and reading other things." I said, "Okay." By the way, things have changed. Nowadays, they would be happy if a kid in junior high school read, I don't know, pornography, as long as they're reading, right? That's what you want kids to do, get engaged with the written word. But this proved to be a wonderful thing in my life, because I never did go back to the junior high school library, but I discovered my local library on Alton Avenue in the Bronx, and I read every science fiction novel and collection of stories that I could. And that is where, in the early to mid 50s, I discovered James Blish. And James Blish and Alfred Bester and a few other people, they were like sort of the second tier in the hierarchy. So if Asimov, Heinlein, and Clarke were the top triumvirate, people like Blish and Bester were right below them. Note, by the way, that there were no women there or African Americans, but fortunately, it didn't take too long for the world of science fiction to catch up on that score, because that began to happen in the 1960s. But anyway, As a kid, I read James Blish's series called Cities in Flight. It was a really imaginative series that cities were literally able to take off and go out there into space. Um, but it wasn't until a few years later that I read his novel, A Case of Conscience. And this is a novel which is actually based on a short story. And here, let me just mention that short stories in many ways have been the root of great science fiction novels and series. The Foundation series, now on Apple TV. Many people say it started with Isaac Asimov's trilogy in the 1950s. Actually, it started with a series of stories that Asimov published in Astounding magazine in the 1940s, and those were put together and a few other elements were added to make the trilogy in the 1950s. Dune also started as a series of stories, and so did A Case of Conscience, not a series of stories, but a novella in a little known magazine called If Magazine that was published in 1953. By the way, let me just mention, as far as Dune is concerned, despite the fact that there were a series of stories that Frank Herbert wrote that were very successful, his novel was turned down by 25 different publishers until he found a publisher in the 1960s. This relates to another area that I don't have time to talk about, but the damage that gatekeeping has done, and apropos of Roger's talk, that also not only is an indication of the racism and prejudice in the 1950s, but the idiotic, insensitive gatekeeping of great writers who were turned down over and over again. And by the way, it not only pertained to science fiction, it pertained to other kinds of writing. A Confederacy of Dunces, which went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, not science fiction, that was turned down. The author was so despondent he took his life. It's not the fault of the publisher, but nonetheless, they didn't help. The Beatles themselves were turned down by almost 24 record companies. Imagine that someone, Samuel Delaney does come to mind. The Beatles were turned down by almost 24 record companies. Someone came in and heard them think, "Oh yeah, I tell you something. I think I don't think it has a hook. It just doesn't grab me." Anyway, this, by the way, although Amazon is subject to a lot of criticism for valid reasons, and Jeff Bezos is in the news for all kinds of reasons, both good and bad. In fact, Blue Origins is going to launch very soon a rocket with William Shatner in it. One of the other things that Bezos and Amazon deserve credit for is the Kindle revolution, which has done away with gatekeeping. So anyone who writes anything can get it published and get it out there to the world. Anyway, to get back to Blish and a Case of Conscience, the novel was published in 1958. It won a Hugo Award in 1959. The hero is an Hispanic Jesuit who is on a mission with other people. The hero also has medical knowledge, so you can sort of think of this hero as, to delve into Star Trek again, as sort of a Dr. McCoy who not only is a doctor, but a Jesuit. And that makes sense if you think about it, because, certainly spaceships, unlike Star Trek in the very, very early days, don't have room for many crew members. So it makes sense that there would be a doubling of expertise. And without getting too much into the plot, the hero Jesuit has to decide if intelligent beings living on another planet are real, if they have real sentience and souls. This, by the way, raises a very, very important question of what in real life will happen in the future, as we get out into space. The easy part is we have our religions here, but what are we going to do with other sentient beings that we find out there, assuming that we do find them out there? It'll be pretty sad and disappointing if we don't. But A Case of Conscience is a great example of the struggle to make sense of these beings, which on the one hand seem to be intelligent. And what happens if there are 2 or 3 intelligent species out there, and maybe one is trying to play a trick on us? So I highly recommend it. It's a very interesting novel. I will point out that Guy Consolmagno, also known as the Pope's astronomer, he's a real person, also head of the Vatican Observatory, who I've gotten to know fairly well, thought that A Case of Conscience did not have accurate knowledge of how the Jesuits work. And people who defended the novel said, well, hey, maybe in the future the Jesuits change some of what they did. So, I mean, that's and how they operate. So that's a good point. Consolmagno also said that the Sparrow drives him nuts. So that's a good segue into the second Jesuits in Space novel that I want to talk about. That is written by, as I'm sure you all know, Mary Doria Russell. It's published in 1996. It wins the Arthur C. Clarke Award and the James Tiptree Award. It has similarities to A Case of Conscience, maybe first and foremost because the lead Jesuit there is also Hispanic. And Russell said that's just a coincidence. It doesn't really matter, but I find that interesting and significant. And this also, by the way, represents, and both Russell and Blish deserve credit for making a lead character, not just an Anglo-white man. And again, this is Russell in 1996 and Blish, the original story, way back in 1953. Here it's a lot more realistic than A Case of Conscience. First of all, there's travel to a real known star system, the Alpha Centauri system. And here, let me mention that before I read The Sparrow, I wrote most of my own novel. It's my second published novel, Borrowed Tides, about the first starship to Alpha Centauri. And I don't know what it is about Alpha Centauri, but my novel, Borrowed Tides, has been declared by one or more critics as my worst novel. And I, of course, can't have a worse novel. I don't know what they're talking about. But on the other hand, I guess everybody has to have a worse novel. They can't all be equally great. But the reason why that novel has not found favor with some science fiction fans is it's a very metaphysical, religious novel. And although there's not a specific Jesuit hero in the novel, there is this religious, spiritual tone throughout the story. In any case, just as A Case of Conscience is not a happy novel by any means, so The Sparrow is not a happy novel. Also, the Jesuits have an expanded role because although the lead character in A Case of Conscience is a Jesuit, in the case of The Sparrow, the whole expedition is a Jesuit expedition to Alpha Centauri in response to some kind of musical interlude that's received here on Earth. And as Russell notes in her introduction, the United Nations is endlessly debating what to do about this. The Jesuits get together and in a relatively short period of time send out a mission. So here I would say, good. Let's hear it for autocracy. Democracy is not always the best way of doing everything. It's a great way of running government, for sure, But is it the best way of getting out into space in general? Well, maybe not. And here I'll just note parenthetically, another one of my interests is jumpstarting the space program, or doing what I can to get more people out into space. And one of the things I sadly noted is that here in the United States, our democracy has done a rather poor job of getting us out into space after we landed on the moon, right? So, I mean, basically, JFK says we're going to get on the moon by the end of the decade. He's assassinated. Johnson throws all his money into the space program. Nixon, by the way, hated it because he saw JFK written all over it. And we do get to the moon, but a combination of Nixon, it was a bipartisan thing, and Walter Mondale, who was a senator there back then, later becomes vice president, they do their best to shortchange NASA, and we're still suffering the result of that. Which, to get back to another point, that's why I'm glad to see what's bipartisan is Nixon was a Republican and Walter Mondale a Democrat. That's what I mean by bipartisan. And furthermore, when Jimmy Carter became president after Nixon and Ford, he didn't do much for the space program either. So to get back to the my point about the Sparrow, an excellent part of that story is you think of, you know, religious orders as like endlessly musing and contemplating, but they can act quickly as well when need be. By the way, let me raise another point. I'll just talk for a few more minutes. I mean, you know, James made a mistake when he said, I'm sure Paul can talk longer. I could go on here for 3 hours. But just a couple of other very brief points. I mentioned yesterday there was a review in the Library Journal. I looked this up. The writer of the review is Nancy Pearl, who proclaimed that the Sparrow is not science fiction. Why? Because it deals in philosophic issues and examines issues like good versus evil. So that's not science fiction. So this is like a pet peeve of mine, the derogation of science fiction as to something that can't be serious. The New York Times, by the way, has unconsciously or maybe consciously bought into this, because throughout its history, it almost never reviews science fiction in a normal way. It has a column called Science Fiction, and it sticks like 3 or 4 stories in on page 34. But if you have a novel about a dysfunctional Southern family, oh, perfect. We're going to put that on the front page. So, you know, this is an old story. And I have to say, it's not science fiction. Sometimes even authors themselves, you know, say that their work is not science fiction. Margaret Atwood doesn't think The Handmaid's Tale is science fiction. She thinks it's speculative fiction. Okay. By the way, isn't all fiction speculative? I'm just saying. And Kurt Vonnegut also, he went back and forth. There were times that, no, Cass Cradle is not science fiction. Okay. But then he said it is science fiction. I'm especially aware of this because I was vice president and president of the Science Fiction Writers of America for a couple of years back at the beginning of the 21st century. And the organization, the Science Fiction Writers of America, used to fight back against this all the time. By the way, you sometimes currently hear people say, this is science, not science fiction. And again, with science fiction being used as some kind of crazy thing, there's actually a long history of science fiction stimulating science and scientists to do great work. So, for example, Marvin Minsky, the great AI scientist, the late Marvin Minsky, cites the Foundation series as getting him started on Isaac Asimov's Robot series. And Paul Krugman, a Nobel laureate in economics, cites the Foundation series. Final points I'll make. I had a conversation, by the way, with Guy Consolmagno after a little conference I organized at Fordham University a couple of years ago. He informed me that these things could never happen, like what happened in the Sparrow. I guess one of the reasons why the Sparrow drives him crazy, because the Vatican doesn't have enough money. Isn't that sad? So the Vatican doesn't have money. They can't send up a ship. So all that Guy Consolmagno, who I think he's a great guy, but the best that he can do is talk about space and criticize novels. He can't actually get people out to space. And actually, here are really the last 2 points. I actually wrote a non-space Jesuit science fiction story called Advantage Bellarmine, about Cardinal Bellarmine. It's a time travel story. It was published in Analog in the late 1990s. And a revised version of that story is the second chapter in my novel Chronica, which in turn is the third novel in my time travel series, The Plot to Save Socrates, Unburning Alexandria, and Chronica, where the hero is Sierra Waters, a doctoral student. And here, last but not least, I just want to mention to you Joshua Ambrosius, who's done a lot of research into religion and space travel. He picked up in his research that among all the religious groups that he surveyed, that Catholics have a slight edge. They are slightly more enthusiastic, but it's statistically significant. It's slight, but statistically significant, slightly more enthusiastic about space travel. So maybe these Jesuit novels helped in some way. Good luck to William Shatner. I hope everything goes well in that little voyage. You'll be in space for 3 minutes, but better than nothing. Thank you very much for your attention.